This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Yesterday I made a video about how the wild success of D&D 5th edition was due to a perfect combination of a bunch of factors that were completely outside the control of the game's publishers, Wizards of the Coast. And we touched on how a lot of these elements that brought success to D&D are fading. Stranger Things is wrapping up, Critical Role is making its own RPG, YouTubers like Matt Colville and Dungeon Coach are doing the same, and a bunch of other YouTubers are branching out to discuss other games as often as they can. So today we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to talk about why I believe D&D 2024 is going to fail. Now, I know this seems like a way more negative video than I normally make, so let me be clear. I don't think D&D 2024 is going to sell poorly. I think it'll probably sell pretty well. In fact, if we compare it to the Dragon Slayers, which is the blanket and knowingly inaccurate term for the wave of new heroic fantasy TTRPGs announced after the OGL Crisis, well then I think D&D is probably going to sell better than all of them. I'm also not claiming that the new edition is automatically bad, because I don't think that's the case either. I haven't had a chance to read through my copy yet, but I've been checking out the assessments online, and while I'm still going to read it and play it and form my own opinions, I can already tell that some of the changes are things I'll love, and some are things I have a big problem with. I don't know how I'll feel about the game compared to 2014 D&D, but generally speaking, the reception to the new rules seems generally positive. So that's not my point either. I don't think that the game is going to be negatively received. Additionally, I'm not making this video because I hope Wizards of the Coast fails, because that's not the case either. I want Wizards of the Coast to make better choices, or at least just shut up and stop getting in their own way, and more on that later. But this isn't a takedown video of D&D because of the decisions made by the higher-ups at Wizards and Hasbro. I'm a Marvel fan and a Star Wars fan. I've long ago made my peace with the fact that the products I love might be produced by deeply unethical companies. Now, today I'm going to talk about why I believe Hasbro will ultimately find this new edition to be a failure, even if the rest of us believe it's a smashing success. Because I think Hasbro has already shot themselves in the foot, and they don't even realize it yet. Before we get into it, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. A lot of time people think they're subscribed, but then they realize they aren't, so even if you think you're subscribed, just take a quick look and make sure, because you might be surprised. First, we're going to start off by discussing the obvious stuff. The series of unforced errors, the number of ways Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro have alienated the D&D audience for no reason, particularly over the past couple of years. Now, there have always been varying degrees of dissatisfaction with D&D throughout the lifespan of 5e. People complained about the Ranger from day one. A few of the early adventures, particularly Horde of the Dragon Queen, Prince of the Apocalypse, and Tomb of Annihilation, were kind of a mess. Each new player supplement introduced more power creep into the game because better subclasses sold more books, so soon, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything was a must-have book, despite the way it raised the entire power level of the game. But in my opinion, this is all the standard stuff that you could sort of expect from a modern version of D&D, and you make your peace with if you otherwise still enjoy the game. The Ranger is frustrating, but there was an Unearthed Arcana version you could use instead, until they released some more official changes in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Those adventures were irritating to run, so people focused on the ones that were more fun, like Lost Mine of Phandelver and Curse of Strahd. If you didn't like 5e's power creep, you could either ban certain subclasses or books, or you moved on and stopped playing 5th edition entirely. But this is bog standard, do you enjoy this version of D&D stuff. But in 2021 and 2022, we started getting some real, honest-to-God controversies. 2021's Strixhaven book introduced the spell Silvery Barbs, and that was like dropping a bomb on the community. It was immediately beloved by Wizard players and reviled by GMs. 2022's Spelljammer box set was generally poorly received, with broken or missing mechanics and an adventure premise that didn't match the character creation options. And also, the Hadozi race had some new, weirdly racist lore, but nothing in the history of 5e caused as much of a shakeup as the OGL scandal. We're not going to relitigate this whole thing today, but if you're not familiar with what happened, here's a super quick summary. At the beginning of 2023, we found out Wizards of the Coast wanted to cancel the Open Gaming license and replace it with one with far more draconian terms. The OGL allows other publishers, large and small, to make their own D&D adventures compatible with 5e without getting sued by Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro. And when we learned that Wizards of the Coast wanted to get rid of this agreement, people were pissed. Aside from the argument that WotC legally couldn't end the OGL, the fact that they were even trying frightened a lot of publishers who made content that was compatible with 5e. These publishers didn't want to risk publishing D&D content anymore if there was no longer the reassurance that they wouldn't face legal action from Hasbro, a huge company that no other publisher could compete with. So a bunch of these publishers started working on their own heroic fantasy RPGs just so they wouldn't have to be in that precarious situation again, and we'll talk more about that later on. This new OGL also would have essentially ended the ability of other virtual tabletops to easily host the 5th edition basic rules without making a deal with WotC, and that could have been used to shut down the competition for Wizards of the Coast's own upcoming VTT. And after a lot of public pressure, after less than a month, Wizards of the Coast finally backed off and put the 5e rules into Creative Commons, so this could never happen again with that specific version of the game. But that's a start. Now, for some people, that was more than enough to walk away from Wizards of the Coast forever, and you know what, that's fair enough. However, I'm a fan of positive reinforcement. I threatened to stop playing 5e and using D&D Beyond at the time because I wanted the company to reverse course. once they did that, I felt comfortable giving them my business again. Not because I thought they felt bad about what they'd done, but because I assumed they'd at least learned that these sort of unethical business practices were actually bad for business. That lasted maybe a couple of months, because then the hits just kept on coming. A YouTuber accidentally got his hands on the wrong Magic the Gathering cards, so Wizards of the Coast sent the Pinkertons, famous union busters and all-around corporate enforcers, to bully him at his house and make his wife cry. Because when you want someone to be delicate, you don't call the Pinkertons. Actually, when you make an honest mistake, you also don't call the Pinkertons. Generally speaking, here's some free professional advice: don't call the Pinkertons. And sure, the D&D team isn't the same as the Magic the Gathering team, but someone at Wizards of the Coast still called them in, and that was a messed up thing to do. Then, later in 2023, Kyle Brink did a bunch of interviews, going on what we all collectively agreed to call the Kyle Brink OGL Apology Tour. And he made some comments that didn't exactly inspire confidence in Wizards of the Coast. I'm not talking about how he discussed having a more diverse team and how that's better for the game, and a bunch of racist asshole grifters interpreted that in the least charitable way possible in order to claim Wizards of the Coast was anti-white, so spare me with that bullshit. But I personally was frustrated by some of his other answers. For example, halfway through the OGL Crisis, someone at Wizards posted a really boneheaded response on D&D Beyond, basically saying they were going to revise their new OGL to address some of the concerns, which of course was not true. That was a band-aid on the problem that didn't address the root of a lot of the issues, but once again, we're not going to get into all that today. But that post included some really condescending language about the people protesting this OGL issue, including the infamously tone-deaf phrase, "They won, and so did we." And so when Kyle Brink was doing his apology tour interviews, somebody asked him who had written that infamous post, and he said that he didn't know. And I honestly hope he was just lying to protect somebody, because I've never worked at a job where that would have been an acceptable answer to a situation like that. The right answer, if you're wondering, is I'm not going to reveal the individual behind that, because while I know most of the community is overwhelmingly respectful and responsible, there was some online harassment of our team members online, and so all I can say is that the individual in question pretty quickly realized that their response was inappropriate. They're not going to make public statements on behalf of the D&D team in the future, but in the interest of moving forward and putting this incident behind us, we won't be divulging who wrote that post. Again, I have no problem with the company protecting that poster's identity. That's what the company should do in that situation. You want to keep them from being harassed, I get it. But if you're trying to clean up a PR disaster and you don't even know who made the situation a lot worse than it needed to be, then you're not doing your job. Speaking of somebody not doing their job, Bigby Presents the Glory of the Giants had some AI artwork inside, as did a promotional image from Magic the Gathering. And while apparently those were both done by external contractors and Wizards of the Coast denounced both instances as violations of its company policy to not use AI, it's kind of bad that nobody noticed these images used AI until they were out in the world, right? I'll be honest, I don't always notice AI art when I see it. The obvious stuff, sure, but I probably wouldn't have noticed the Glory of the Giants example if others hadn't pointed it out. But also, I'm not the art director for a very famous book publisher. If you are, and you know generative AI is a thing, and you have a policy against it, which Wizards of the Coast did, then it really is your job to catch that before the book goes to print. And also, as recently as this month, the current Wizards of the Coast CEO, Chris Cox, has been praising the potential of finding an ethical way to still use AI in the future, so I don't know, man. I get why people are so distrustful of Wizards on the subject of AI. Even if they can find a way to use AI that doesn't steal content, and that's a big fucking maybe, by the way, but using AI would still cost other artists and writers jobs. It is only a tool to cut corners and devalue the work of the incredible roster of collaborators Wizards of the Coast has built up over the past few decades. Sure, Wizards hasn't deliberately done anything with AI yet in a public-facing product, and maybe they were just saying that they want to appease the stockholders, and that's a whole other problem we don't have time to get into today. But the fact that they're saying that they want to makes it pretty hard to justify giving them the benefit of the doubt. Of course, I can imagine Wizards is especially tempted to cut corners these days, considering Hasbro made them lay off 1,100 people right before Christmas in 2023, which is especially galling because Wizards of the Coast was making money. It was the rest of Hasbro that was struggling. Well, not all the rest of Hasbro, obviously. The Hasbro CEO took home $9 million that year. Hey, here's some more free professional advice. If you're looking for places to cut costs, it seems like maybe that's the place to start.
You were less than 90 days from being insolvent. I had 3 different accountants try to explain it to me. The whole place has to be streamlined.
Start with 2 of the accountants.
So that was 2023, and 2024 was not as eventful, but there were definitely still some incidents. First of all, books were getting delayed in other countries, but even right here in the USA, the Book of Many Things was delayed because the cards didn't print correctly. Wizards of the Coast, publishers of Magic the Gathering, the most famous card game on the planet after Pokemon, which they also used to print, by the way, had printing issues with the cards. Hey, just an unrelated thought, I wonder if any of those 1,100 people that got laid off had important jobs that needed to be filled. I'm not sure what made me think of that just now. Then the company ended the ability for you to individually purchase features from their books on D&D Beyond. It used to be possible to not buy an entire book, but still only buy the content you wanted to use. You could individually pay for a monster, or a spell, or a subclass. And I don't necessarily know if that was a great deal or anything. Like, I don't know if that pricing was fair compared to the amount of content you could get if you bought the entire book. But this option did give players and even game masters the ability to a la carte purchase only the content they needed and they planned to use in their games. They no longer had to drop a bunch of money on an entire book if they weren't going to use more than 5% of it. They could just buy the stuff they wanted. But presumably, someone at Wizards of the Coast realized that if they turned off this feature, they might get more sales of full books. Because now if you wanted a subclass and a couple of spells from the latest release, you had to buy the whole book, just like you would if you bought physical books. It seemed like a pretty obvious cash grab. Now this is also around the time that D&D Beyond started hosting third-party products like Tal'Dorei Reborn and Dungeons of Drakkenheim, and so it is also possible these companies agreed to an arrangement with D&D Beyond that didn't include a la carte purchases, because these companies work off a business model that actually depends on the entire book being published. But still, when the entire community already has a chip on their shoulder because of some other actions you've been taking, and you don't actually offer a decent reason why you're turning off this functionality, of course everybody's going to assume it was done as a cash grab. But you know what? Despite all this, it did actually seem like a lot of people were getting excited about the new edition, or at least were eager to see what had changed so they could decide whether they wanted to pick up the new rulebooks or not. And so Wizards of the Coast reached out to a bunch of YouTubers and gave them the opportunity to review content from the new Player's Handbook. At first, we got a wave of coordinated videos where each YouTuber focused on some different aspect of the book, a single species, a certain class or subclass, a specific rule change, etc. Then Jeremy Crawford, the head rules designer for the new edition, sat down to answer some questions about the rules changes, how the game was backwards compatible with 2014 D&D, that kind of thing. And then they just started giving YouTubers the chance to make videos about the entire Player's Handbook, no limits, no restrictions, just an embargo. They couldn't post their videos before a certain date, but afterwards, there were apparently no caveats. Now this is around the same time as Gen Con, which is the first chance people had to pick up physical copies of the Player's Handbook. So if you were a YouTuber who didn't receive a digital or physical copy of the new Player's Handbook from Wizards of the Coast, but you also happen to be at Gen Con, you could just pick up your own copy at the convention and do your own review. And I remember being really encouraged when I saw how many of these channels have been approached by Wizards of the Coast. I was honestly the most surprised to see that D&D Shorts had received a copy, because during the Kyle Brink apology tour, he referred to D&D Shorts in a way that made it seem like that channel had specifically ruffled some feathers and had been placed on some sort of shit list. But clearly somebody had realized that it was better to try to move forward in good faith and approach this unofficial team of cheerleaders who really do like this game and want to talk about it on YouTube for free, and maybe then you could actually work out some sort of arrangement that would be beneficial to everyone. But it turns out that somebody at Wizards of the Coast didn't get the memo about how this was all supposed to go down, because all of a sudden, after some of these videos went up, Wizards of the Coast lawyers jumped into action and started demanding changes to the reviews with brand new stipulations about which pages were now off limits from being shown off on camera. Some channels were forced to blur or pull down their videos, and Jordan received a copyright strike without any opportunity to change the video. And copyright strikes are extremely powerful weapons used by copyright holders to punish channels that have crossed the line. If you get 3 copyright strikes, your channel gets nuked. But Jordan hadn't crossed any line that he was aware of. Nobody had been told that this restriction existed when the Player's Handbook had been distributed. All these channels had made reviews in good faith and had not been told that there were any concerns about showing too much of the book. And now they were being asked to blur huge sections of their videos after their videos were already live. And this is almost certainly just an instance of the legal team not being in proper communication with whoever reached out to these YouTubers, presumably someone from the Wizards of the Coast publicity team. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. But once again, Wizards of the Coast took a community that had actually gotten excited about their new product and gave them a brand new reason to not want to get involved with something this company had produced. Now, in their correspondence requesting the YouTubers make these changes, Wizards of the Coast team members argued that the reason they couldn't include these layouts from the books in these videos is because Wizards didn't want somebody scanning through all these videos and taking screenshots and using those to create an illegal PDF. Because Wizards seems terrified of PDF piracy of their products. I believe 4th edition books did used to be available as PDFs, but I can also tell you that every other publisher in the hobby produces PDFs of their books these days. So you can either publish them on their own, like you would order a physical book, or you can get a combo and get the PDF and the physical book. Everybody offers that. It's an extremely common business practice. But for 5th edition, Wizards of the Coast has never done that. I suspect they saw how many PDFs of the 4th edition books were floating around and being shared among the members of the community, and so they assume that putting out PDFs of their books might cost them sales. And yeah, 4th edition did seem to sell pretty badly, at least compared to their expectations. And presumably that became even more true as the edition went on. But do the folks at Wizards of the Coast really think that the only reason 4th edition didn't sell well is because people could get their hands on PDFs of the game? Because I promise you, that is not why people were not buying and playing 4th edition. But that fear of PDF seems to have driven this spontaneous reaction that flip-throughs of the book were no longer to be allowed on YouTube. But of course, this was really bad PR for the company because they hadn't warned anybody about this policy until after the videos were live. And so in just a couple of days, someone on the D&D team busted their ass to fix the situation. Wizards of the Coast reversed course, the videos were allowed to be posted as normal, Jordan's copyright strike was removed, and in the aftermath, The only thing WotC got from the experience was bad press. And this is ultimately so indicative of how almost all these controversies have played out. The company does a thing, they get heat for it online, and they publicly walk it back. And so they look like the bad guys, and they also don't even get the benefits of whatever draconian policy they were trying to employ. It's the worst of both worlds. And while I am ultimately glad that this company is so easy to bully into doing the right thing, eventually at least, it's also really frustrating to see the same thing happen over and over, because I like this game, and I know the designers are trying their best to be responsible members of the community. But the corporation they work for somehow keeps tripping over its own dick. We're, almost halfway through the video, and all we've done so far is discuss their controversies over the past 25 months. Seriously, how? How does this keep happening? And something like this actually just happened again in only the past couple of weeks. But this one's interesting because I think it speaks to a more fundamental disconnect between Wizards of the Coast and its audience. So if you're not familiar with the most recent D&D Beyond controversy, here's what happened. They posted a changelog that was going to demonstrate upcoming adjustments to the platform, which is a pretty standard thing for them to do. However, this changelog also made note of the fact that the 2014 material was going to start getting classified with a legacy tag. Okay, fair enough. There's a new edition of the game, you need to make sure people know which version of the material they're looking at. That's how it works. However, the 2014 material was not going to be available through the character sheets, only the search function. And the spells and magic items weren't even going to get a 2014 tag at all. Sure, you can still see them if you open the digital book, but if you searched for a spell, you would only get the 2024 version. If you wanted to use any 2014 material when making a character, now you had to homebrew your own version of it using the 2014 rules you already had access to. Then you could assign that homebrew content to a character sheet. But this requires knowing that the option that you're trying to select is going to be different, and if you can't see the 2014 versions or anything on the character sheets, then how on earth are you supposed to know whether or not you needed to homebrew something in order to use the 2014 version? Now, immediately, everybody knew what the obvious solution was to this problem. Just add a button on the first page of the character creator so you can make sure your character sheet only pulls content from the 2014 rules. And once again, after being bullied online for this very strange decision for like a day or two, that's the feature they eventually added. Right now, D&D Beyond is kind of a mess, which is, I guess, understandable with the new edition coming out. But among some of the other broken systems, I want to highlight the fact that if you play a 2014 subclass, at least as of the time of recording, you don't currently have a way to select 2024 spells. And you are supposed to be able to do that. You should be able to access 2014 subclasses and 2024 spells for the same character because that's the way their backwards compatibility is supposed to work between editions. And I think that was exactly why they wanted to just default switch everyone's spells to the 2024 versions. So that way if you're playing a 2014 class, you still have access to the 2024 spells. But they apparently completely failed to imagine that all these people who were using D&D Beyond for their home games and are in the middle of a campaign right now might not actually want to switch to the 2024 rules in the middle of a campaign. So in this case, the minor issue is that they failed to communicate why they were doing what they're doing. We are doing this so you can play the 2024 rules but still use a 2014 subclass that is not in the 2024 Player's Handbook. An announcement like that might have actually helped people at least understand what the designers are thinking. But this actually seems to speak to a bigger issue, which is that the people who at least run D&D Beyond, if not the designers of the new game system or the people who run the company, at least the people running D&D Beyond didn't seem to understand why people might not even want to switch editions. It apparently didn't even occur to them to make sure you could still play 2014 D&D without issue, because as far as they're concerned, they're giving you a bunch of the new rules for free, so why wouldn't you switch? And I will definitely admit that this did not make me as angry as it made a lot of other people, but that's because I had a very different reaction. I saw this, and I just nodded and said, yeah, that makes sense. Because when we buy a book through D&D Beyond, we don't actually own it. We're leasing it. That's why I've sort of started not buying the books anymore. I will probably pick up the new Player's Handbook on D&D Beyond at some point, since I know my players will want to use it, and I run paid games, and I talk about books on my channel, so it's a tax write-off for me. But I'm not really in a hurry because it's not because I don't like the book or because I don't want to give Wizards of the Coast money for moral reasons, literally just because it's hard for me to justify the expense most of the time. I'd rather get the physical book because then WotC can never change it. And then whenever D&D Beyond eventually shuts down, and whether it's in 5 years or 50, we'll have to decide whether it was worth it to buy the books digitally on a platform we didn't control and then lose all that money that we spent when that platform goes away. I saw so many people upset that they could no longer play 2014 D&D with the 2014 rules through D&D Beyond anymore. And of course they were upset. That's deeply frustrating. They seriously didn't seem to think anyone might want to level up their 2014 character sheets anymore. That is bizarre. But I also wasn't surprised that the official platform switched to the new rules, because once again, I already spent a lot of time coming to terms with the fact that we don't own anything we buy through the site. We are always at the mercy of WotC to change whatever they want. I wish we could play older versions of the game through the official platform. Trust me, I would love it if you could log into D&D Beyond and play 4th edition. I'm sure some of you would love to play 3.5 or AD&D on a virtual resource that's as good as D&D Beyond. But that's what all these other platforms can offer. You could probably play a lot of these older editions through other virtual tabletops, something Roll20 was quick to point out after this D&D Beyond controversy. Seriously, A+ move by Roll20's social media manager. I wish the official D&D platform would offer support to older editions, but I don't think that's going to happen, because they don't want you to look backwards. They want you playing the new version so they can sell you the new books. That's how their business works. But even with all that being said, it's still super weird that designers didn't realize that not everyone was going to play the new edition automatically. And that brings me to the topic I want to talk about next. The fact that we are about to enter a brand new edition war. If you're not familiar because this is your first edition war, welcome. It's very silly. Basically, edition wars happen whenever we get a new version of D&D. Inevitably, some players and groups will feel that the previous edition was better, and they'll keep playing that edition. Meanwhile, other players will switch to the new edition, and new players will start playing the new edition by default. And this part is fine, there's nothing wrong with any of that. But a difference of opinion becomes an edition war when one side or the other believes their preferred version of the game is superior to all others. Now let's be clear, there is no such thing as a perfect version of D&D. There's just the version that you like best. But in the eyes of an edition warrior, if you like a different version of the game, you're actually a bad person. And I just have no patience for that kind of one true wayism. Now, when Matt Colville discussed the edition wars of the past, he talked about how there really haven't been any edition wars recently, not in the same way we used to get. Because in the old days, forums were filled with people arguing over which version of D&D was superior, and calling each other truly heinous things over which game they preferred to play in their free time. But Matt argued that these days, the majority of online discussion focuses on D&D 5e. And in fact, a lot of the people discussing D&D online maybe haven't even played another edition, simply because so many new people started playing with 5e. And I do think that for the most part, there really isn't an edition war comparing 5e to older editions. Sure, it happens sometimes, but not nearly as big a part of the hobby as it used to be. However, this is where I'm going to argue that Matt Colville was wrong, because edition wars didn't go away. They evolved. Because in 2008, D&D 4th edition came out and some people really didn't like it, so they kept playing 3.5. Standard edition war, although maybe this one was just a little bit more weighted toward the incumbent than usual, but they wanted more content for the version of the game they enjoyed. And then they got it in 2009, when Paizo basically republished their own version of 3.5 and just called it Pathfinder. Paizo literally just wanted to keep publishing the same products they were already making, and they knew there was an audience for them. So they put out their own version of the core rules just so they could keep making adventures. So now if you preferred 3.5 to 4e, you were probably a Pathfinder player. And this is what the new edition war looked like. Not 4e versus 3.5, but D&D versus Pathfinder. And this is notable for two reasons. First, 4th edition was not the slam dunk it needed to be. And within 4 years, WotC had announced they were going to be working on a new edition of the game with a plan to playtest it for 2 years to then sync up the release with the game's 40th anniversary. Meanwhile, Pathfinder was trucking along and continuing to be a huge success. Despite rumors, we don't ever know that that game actually outsold D&D 4th edition, but it did outlast it, which means for the first time in history, an edition war had a winner. But that brings me to my second point. Now, edition war wasn't just a debate over which edition you preferred, but because they were published by different companies, you were essentially picking teams between which corporation you wanted to support. Arguably, 2nd edition and 3rd edition were published by different companies since Wizards of the Coast acquired TSR, but they weren't being published concurrently, unlike D&D and Pathfinder. But now, they're being published by different companies, and which one you support is part of the conversation. These days, if you say you don't like a rule in 5e, someone will jump out of the woodwork and tell you that you should play Pathfinder instead. But if you also say that you don't like Wizards of the Coast standard business practices, you'll get the same response. You should play Pathfinder instead. It's not about which version of the game you like anymore. Now it's also about which team is more virtuous. What's also funny is that Pathfinder has entered its 2nd edition, and I know some Pathfinder fans were spicy about that because they literally played Pathfinder because they didn't want their favorite edition to change, and now it was changing. And truthfully, I'm not really in the online Pathfinder community, so I don't know if they got another full-on edition war in that game. But I do know that a lot of people really like Pathfinder 2, especially in contrast to 5e. So once again, the edition war is alive and well in the D&D versus Pathfinder debate. And at the same time, you've got the OSR movement. The old school renaissance is the most common definition that I've heard. While Pathfinder was originally modeled after 3.5, the OSR sprung out of a desire to play older editions of D&D like 1st and 2nd edition. And unlike Pathfinder, the OSR is not one system produced by one company, but instead a collection of independent games, all trying to capture a feeling. Some of these games are more directly inspired by the rules of 1st and 2nd edition, while others incorporate more modern game design, but still try to replicate the experience gamers had with the old school games. 2023's Shadow Dark is a perfect example of the latter, in that the mechanics themselves are heavily inspired by 5e, but the mood of the game is directly a throwback to the old school D&D. Now once again, I'm not really tied into the OSR movement enough to know how much competition there is between these different games. I'm sure there are some spirited debates over which games people prefer, but from what little I can see from the outside, I haven't seen anything close to the level of vitriol that comes from other edition wars. It seems like a lot of OSR players understand the differences between each individual OSR games are so specific that they say a lot more about each individual player's preferences than they do about which game is actually better than the others. From what I've seen, it's way more common for OSR players to prefer any OSR game over D&D 5e, rather than focusing on which OSR game they prefer. But once again, if you're uncomfortable giving your money to a big corporation like WotC, the OSR games are almost all indie games, and a lot of them just have one designer. And who among us could argue that it's not more ethical to put your money toward a small creator rather than a massive corporation like WotC? So once again, if you play 5e, you might not be judged for just playing the game. You'll be judged as a bad person because you bought the product of a big corporation. And if you generally like 5e, but wished it packed a little bit more of a punch, there was also Level Up Advanced 5e from EN World Publishing. It's a totally standalone game, you don't need any Wizards of the Coast books to run Level Up 5e, but it's also backwards compatible if you're already running a 5e game. I haven't had a chance to play or run Level Up 5e yet, but I've heard great things, and I absolutely do want to try it at some point soon. So that was the state of the edition wars as of a couple of years ago. But then the OGL Crisis happened, and a bunch of small publishers realized they didn't want to be a situation like that again. So they started working on their own games. Some were intended to be the publisher's version of D&D. Kobold Press in 2023 was in the same pickle as Paizo in 2009, where their business came from D&D supplements, but now it looked like they'd have to throw out their entire product line. So instead, they worked on Tales of the Valiant, which is just 5th edition with a few minor tweaks. So that way they can keep publishing their old product line, and it's compatible with that game as well. The Dungeon Coach, a fellow YouTuber, launched DC-20, which is kind of like his own version of 6th edition, and it borrows a lot of cool design from Pathfinder 2nd edition. However, other companies started working on systems that were quite different from 5e. MCDM started publicly working on Draw Steel, making a bunch of videos and Patreon posts about how they were basically reconsidering every aspect of game design for these types of games, rather than using 5e as a starting point. And Critical Role's Darrington Press announced Daggerheart, which would use cards as a way to keep track of all your different powers, which really gives me 4th edition flashbacks. And even without most of these games being available to play in any meaningful way yet, with every announcement we got more teams being formed as the community of people fed up with 5e, or especially fed up with Wizards of the Coast, started getting more and more excited about these games being developed by the publishers they personally trusted more. And even though this genre of games being developed after the OGL Crisis came to be known as Dragon Slayers, I don't think anybody actually believes they'll overthrow D&D. The best they can do is steal a portion of its market share away, and to be clear, that would not be nothing. And if someone likes 5e's genre but doesn't like the mechanics or the company behind the game, then it's ultimately a good thing that there are about to be a whole bunch of other alternatives. And I'm really looking forward to trying all these games out when I get some time next year, because I really do want to take all of them for a spin. But also, I get the feeling we're heading toward the granddaddy of all edition wars, because this time it won't just be about which version of the game you prefer, it'll be about which team you're on. And that's when things tend to get really nasty. And I hope that doesn't come to pass. After all, the only thing any of us wants is just to play our games and have a great time doing it. All the rest of it, which rules we're using, which publishers are doing what behind the scenes, none of that matters when we actually sit down and play. When we're playing our games, what we're really looking for are tools that'll make our games easier to play. Which, by the way, reminds me, this video is sponsored by World Anvil. World Anvil is a wonderful website that allows you to create articles of the different NPCs, monsters, magic items, and locations in your world, and then you can share those articles with your players. One of the things I'm most excited about for Daggerheart is the way the game encourages you and your players to build a world together by adding locations to the map. But if you use World Anvil in your games, then you can take that map and upload it to the site, and then when you create articles for the locations that your players created, you can link them right onto the map. And of course, you can hide secrets in your articles with information meant just for you, and not for the player's eyes. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. That is a fantastic discount. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thanks so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Now, look, today I've talked about a bunch of reasons why some players might not be excited about the new edition of the game, and all these are going to be factors that keep some people from trying the new rules. However, D&D can overcome a lot of these simply by being D&D. They will always be the first stop on the road for so many people discovering the games. Even if they do alienate their entire audience, there are a lot more potential players out there. The perfect storm might be over, but every day, someone discovers Critical Role or Dimension 20 or watches the D&D movie, and some of those people will go on to check out D&D. So how can I claim that D&D is going to be a failure in the eyes of Hasbro? Well, because despite all the damage they've done with their audience, all the ways they are their own worst enemy, there's another reason, an even bigger factor that has already set the wheels in motion for 2024 to be a financial disappointment. And that's the fact that during the COVID-19 pandemic, D&D exploded into popularity. And of course it did, right? I just made a whole video talking about how D&D 5e happened to come out during the perfect time, because suddenly there was a whole infrastructure ready to support a thriving interest in D&D, including the extremely influential actual play show Critical Role and the massive cultural juggernaut that was Stranger Things. And so when everyone in the world got stuck indoors with nothing to do for some weird reason, a bunch of people finally said, you know, I've been wanting to give D&D a try. I guess now would be the perfect time. So 2020 and 2021 were huge years for D&D financially. So how is this a problem? How could this possibly have gone wrong.
The bad guy is capitalism. And I don't know how the bad guy is capitalism in Fairy Tale Land, but I am confident that he will have found a way.
Look, nobody should be surprised that D&D did not retain COVID numbers once the pandemic was over. I mean, it's not actually over, but we've all agreed to pretend that it is, so that's close enough, I guess. But the point is, people aren't stuck inside anymore. They went back to work and back to hobbies and back to brunch. And while a lot of people are still playing D&D, not all those games from COVID continued after the lockdown ended. And even if they did, when you're getting into D&D and you want to buy the books, you only need to buy them once. So even if everybody who started playing D&D during the pandemic is still playing, the reason WotC had such a great boost in numbers is because in order to get started, most of those groups had to make a financial investment right at the top. A bunch of those players bought the Player's Handbook, and the DM probably bought the Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and maybe a published adventure. That is a big spike in the profits of WotC all at once. But then what? Nothing. Maybe the DM buys another adventure, maybe a few players buy another player supplement once or twice a year, at most. But that group doesn't need to keep investing money constantly. This is the problem Wizards of the Coast has been trying to solve for decades now. D&D simply is not the kind of business that requires you to come back and buy all the company's products just because you bought the Player's Handbook. 2020 and 2021 were an anomaly because those investment purchases all happened at once, as a whole bunch of people got into the game simultaneously. Well, over the course of a year or two, but that's still pretty good. But then those numbers trailed off. And in a rational system where we can understand that the market ebbs and flows with circumstances outside our control, this wouldn't matter. But that's not the system we have. No, in our capitalist nightmare, companies are required to demonstrate infinite growth. If you did well one year, you have to do better the next year. And even under typical circumstances, this already sucks because you can't realistically expect to make more money every year. That's not how things work. But corporations try to do it anyway. Only now, in 2020, D&D got a bump that any child could have told you was temporary. But in our system, if you're a publicly traded company, you can't ever admit that you know next year is going to be worse than this year. You have to demonstrate to your shareholders that you know how to make even more money next year, even though that is literally impossible. Even though the entire world just experienced a once-in-a-generation disaster that you happen to benefit from. And as D&D Shorts discussed in more detail in his video about the potential death of the D&D monopoly, even if it were enough for D&D to make the same amount of money every year, even if that was acceptable to the higher-ups, they actually did lose money in 2023 compared to 2022, which makes sense given that 23 was the year of the OGL scandal and the D&D movie, which was actually a great movie, but it just underperformed like a lot of movies did last year. D&D's biggest moneymakers for the brand last year came from their licensing deals with LEGO and Baldur's Gate 3. Now, as with any new edition, there are a dozen different factors for why they decided to make a new edition and why they made one now. This is the 50th anniversary, so they want to do something special. The game is 10 years old, and there's things the designers want to change, especially as a response to community feedback. They want to make their own VTT, and some rule changes could make the VTT easier to handle. The core rulebooks were more progressive in a lot of ways than they had been in previous editions, but still contained some antiquated concepts that had been presented without much thought, but that D&D had sought to rectify, so a new set of books could better remove that material. These 2014 rulebooks were also kind of a huge mess, so a new set of books can help resolve that, especially a new Dungeon Master's Guide. But also, obviously, a new edition will make more money. People will buy the new core rulebooks. It'll be a big deal. And maybe 2024 will be a better fiscal year than 2023. I don't know. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a bigger launch than the core rulebooks got in 2014, now that they're coming out in a post-Critical Role, post-Stranger Things world. But I don't know if they're going to beat their COVID numbers. And that is not remotely a comment on the quality of the product. My individual feelings towards D&D's corporate masters aside, I want the new version of the game to be good, because I like it when games are good. I want each new D&D product to be good because until we can get Draw Steel and Daggerheart on shelves in Target, D&D is still, unfortunately, our best chance at bringing new people into the hobby, and so I want people to have a good experience playing it. But I have a feeling that the C-suite at Hasbro and WotC believe this new edition is their key to infinite growth. And I have a sneaking suspicion that they're the only ones who don't know that that's not going to happen. Infinite growth is a fairy tale, and infinite growth after a once-in-a-lifetime event is especially impossible. And yet we, as consumers, have to sit back and watch as these giant corporations in charge of everything fail to learn this lesson over and over again. However, once again, I don't want these designers to fail. I want them to make good products. I don't personally care if they have the best year ever or not, as long as they keep making enough money that the designers get to keep making D&D products and get to keep their jobs. That should be enough. But unfortunately, the people in charge don't recognize success unless it's more success than they've ever seen before. And so, I don't have high hopes for what happens to D&D's product line if those executives are not happy in a couple of years. That being said, I do have a lot of thoughts about the specific products they've announced for next year, maybe even optimistic thoughts? So in tomorrow's video, we're going to take a look at the D&D Direct announcement, and we'll talk about what we learned from that video and what I'm maybe excited for. Because despite all my doom and gloom, I am looking forward to a lot of what's been announced for the new product line. So come back and check out that video tomorrow. In the meantime, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, do all those YouTube things. Support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member to help me keep the lights on, join my Discord to hang out with other awesome people, and sign up for my newsletter to catch all of my updates, and make sure you are registered to vote, and then make sure you are voting in November. You know what? Vote early. If you want to see me talk about other games like Pathfinder, click here for my video where I make a Critical Role character in Pathfinder 2, just as a fun experiment to learn more about the system. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.